Exotic cars have always been known for their sleek and eye-catching designs. From iconic wedge shapes to large wings and spoilers, you can't help but notice them as they speed past. But some cars stand out from the crowd. One of the most dramatic of all the Ferraris is the legendary Testarossa. You always know it's coming from the beautiful howl of that 12-cylinder engine, but when that red wedge shape speeds into view, it sparks an excitement that's hard to suppress. And while it was a wild design, especially for its time, the Testarossa was one of Ferrari's biggest sellers. The Testarossa was such a success. They sold almost 10,000 units across all the different variations. So there's three basic variations of the Testarossa. There's the Testarossa, the 512TR, and the 512M. And one kind of like smaller variation would be the early Testarossas with the flying mirror or the single mirror high up. And those were a short production run, but overall, the Testarossa, throughout all its different variations, was basically the best-selling 12-cylinder Ferrari that was ever made, and it's iconic. It just screams 80s, but like in the best way possible. And it made it a poster car for lots of kids. So what I found is when I'm selling cars, people tend to buy what they had a poster of as a kid. And for me, it was cars like the Testarossa and the F40. For my dad's generation, it was a lot older cars, the 250 series cars, 250 Europas and stuff like that. And so there is a generational shift happening where some of the older cars, while still very desirable, a lot more people as the younger generation is getting into the market are buying cars like this. So the Testarossa is finally like coming into its prime and really being valued how it always, I feel like, should have been. It was undervalued for a long time, and people are really starting to take notice of this car. And it's not just the poster thing that made them so popular, but movies and video games. So Miami Vice and different car games where in the video game you could drive a car like this. And so it really made a lot of people just lust after these cars. The 80s were a time where car manufacturers were trying to come out with wild and crazy designs. And that's when Ferrari introduced this car with its side strakes that the world didn't know it needed until this car came out. And even though it is very 80s, it still works so well today. It doesn't look dated. And so the Testarossa is a variation, it's a progression on the Boxer. So the Boxer was Ferrari's first V12 rear mid-engine car, but it was never made for US emissions and DOT standards, so it was never really made for the US or sold into the US. There was aftermarket Boxers sold here, obviously, but that wasn't where they were made for. So the Testarossa was the first 12-cylinder mid-engine Ferrari made for the US market. And it really does have a couple upsides to the Boxer. So for instance, the Boxer, besides not meeting EPA standards, even the later variations of the Boxer produced about 345 horsepower. But with the Testarossa, they added 4 valves and changed the ignition and the fuel injection system. So the Testarossa was able to produce 385 horsepower. So not only was it US legal, but it also was faster than the Boxer, which made it a best-selling car very quickly. While the side strakes on the Testarossa is very iconic, it wasn't put there just as a styling statement. It's actually part of the design and very functional. So the Boxer had the radiators in the front, and while it worked, it made it so there was basically no luggage room in the front of the car, and the water had to be plumbed to the back. So the hot water going along the sides or kind of underneath would heat up the cockpit. Now they did add really good AC systems for the time to the Boxers to help combat the heating issue, but it still wasn't always the most comfortable, especially if your AC didn't work. So what they did is they added the side mounted radiators, and that means that they had to widen the rear end of the car. So instead of trying to hide it or, style it in a way to hide the wide rear end, they just embraced the wide hips of the Testarossa. And it's one of the first cars and only cars that has a rear end that's really wider than the front end. So it was a great option. It was a great choice they made because it just made the car stand out from the rest. And then they added these strakes because they didn't want, anything getting to the radiator. It was to cover it and protect it, but it just works so well. It was one of the great decisions they made style-wise. And they just went with the whole theme. So they made the wide rear end and they just squared it off in the rear end. So it just has that aggressive and unique look. There was nothing like it when this car was made. In very 80s fashion, the Testarossa has the mouse runner seatbelts. So when you open the door, it like escapes, and then when you close the door, it comes back to choke you to death. But it's like, for me, I'm a little short. I'm 5'7", so it doesn't hit me like too bad in the neck. For somebody who's a little taller, which this car will definitely fit somebody a decent amount taller than me, it would be the perfect height. But it's not, I don't know why people have like such an aversion to the mouse runner seatbelts. I don't think they're that bad. I think they're kind of like retro, I guess. I don't know. But to each their own, I guess. If it's not your thing, it's not your thing. When driving the Testarossa, it's a V12. It's a flat 12, but it's technically like the Boxer, not a true Boxer engine, which some people will argue about, and it's true. It's not a real flat 12, but it's close. It's not a V12, that's for sure. And also, it doesn't have the power steering, but unlike the Daytona or the Boxer, it's not super heavy. It's heavy at low speeds, but not unmanageably so. And as an improvement to the Boxer, it doesn't have as heavy as a clutch, which is nice because you're not like getting a workout every time you go for a drive. And then the interior of the Testarossa is also nice and squared off, much like the rear end is. So it has that the matching kind of feel to it. The interior, the exterior, it all has that edgy kind of feel. One of the things they did do, they put the fuel and oil temp gauge down in like the center console area. So it's not all right in the gauge cluster, but it's still right within view to where you're not like searching around way too much for it. So it's all laid out right where the driver can reach it, and I like the layout of it. They've put the e-brake down on the left side, just like the 328. When the e-brake was in the center console, it was a little bit in the way, so I do like it when the e-brake is down here. The Testarossa has no lack of power. It's awesome. The acceleration, the power, and because it's so wide, it handles like a go-kart. It really just kind of sticks to the ground. It's not a true rear engine, it's a mid-engine, so it has a nice center of gravity. It's nicely balanced. And just overall, I love how the TR drives because it's a little rocket ship. It really is, and it sounds like a true Ferrari 12-cylinder car. So it's not quite the same pure sound as like a C4, but it's just this aggressive, growl that just goes along with the whole aggressive angular design of the car. It's the whole package. To dive into the different variations of the Testarossa just a little bit, so there's 3 basic and 4 particular variations like I mentioned before. So the first is the flying mirror Testarossas. They have the single mirror on the driver's side high up. And while they look really cool and they are very desirable, the single mirror is not my favorite, simply because with a car with wide hips like this one has, you really want good visibility on both sides and to be able to see the rear end of your car a little better. So drive-wise, I prefer the double mirror ones because it's a lot easier to see, and when you're parking, it just makes life that much easier. I do like the look of the flying mirror TRs, but functionality-wise, having 2 mirrors on any car, especially one like this, is definitely a good option. And then you get into the 512 TRs and the 512Ms, which look very similar, but they do have some variations. The grille is a slightly different shape, and like the 512M has the covered headlights instead of pop-up headlights. And while it still looks very nice, I like the original look of the Testarossa the most. I think it has the most aggressive and pure 80s style that just catches my heart. I love it. Now, the 512TR and the 512M do have some really good upgrades. They had some work done to make them just that much better of a driver, but overall, because there was so many less made, because there was about, I think, 7,700 roughly of the Testarossa, and then the rest were the 512 TR and M. So because there were so few of those made, they are a lot more expensive. And if you want the most collectible of any variation of a car, then those are definitely great options. But if you want a good driver that still has that amazing look, then the Testarossa is definitely the way to go. One thing I always appreciate in a Ferrari is when they're actually comfortable to drive. And I can happily say that the Testarossa is quite comfortable. It may not be, you know, as get in it and go and not even think about it as like modern cars, but I mean, that's not the point of buying a classic car. If that's what you're looking for, then a classic car is not the right car for you. But it does have nice, comfortable seats. It's like, it has nice space. You're not really cramped up in the cockpit. You feel spacious for a 2-seater, and you feel like you can just get in this car and go for a long drive with no issues. You know, you don't feel like you're going to be uncomfortable. You don't really worry about the car or how it's going to drive because it's pretty predictable. Just overall, it's one of those cars you can get in and drive distances. Now, it doesn't have a whole bunch of luggage space, but it does have pretty good luggage space. The front compartment, because they've moved the radiators to the side, the front compartment does leave a lot of space for 2 overnight bags. You're not going to be putting 2 check bags in there, you know, 2 big bags, but a couple overnight bags for a weekend away, and it's got all the space for that. The Testarossa, if you've watched my channel for a while, you've heard me talk about the astronomical price of servicing Ferraris. And I have used the Boxer and the Testarossa as an example before because they are some of the more expensive cars to service. So when you're looking to buy a Ferrari, especially a Testarossa or a Boxer, I have said that you always want a car that's been serviced. And I'm doing the video obviously now, and then I already took the photos. So as soon as this is done, I am sending this car off to get its major service done, and I'll be selling it with the service done. And basically the reason that these cars are so expensive to service is because the engine can't come out the top. The whole rear end has to be dropped out the bottom in order to service the car. So it's not that the parts for a TR are so much more expensive than say a 308 or something like that. It's just the labor involved to do it that costs so much. So when you're looking to buy a Testarossa or a Boxer Boxer, or I mean pretty much any Ferrari, but especially models like this, you want to make sure that the major service has been done by a reputable shop. And if it hasn't been done, make sure to get a pre-purchase inspection done, because you never want any nasty surprises. Another thing about this particular car, so it is actually on a salvage title, and the owner has had this car for many, many years. Him and his son have loved it and enjoyed it, and they got into a little bit of an accident where he lost control of the rear end a bit and whacked the side of the car. And I do have photos that I'll show of the damage, and he had it fully repaired by a reputable shop. So there is this big taboo about branded titles. And my theory is basically, if it's a branded title and you have no idea what the extent of the damage was or any idea what happened, then it's a big question mark that could cause problems in the future. But for a car like this, where the owner told me exactly what happened, I have photos of the damage, and we know who repaired it and what was done in the repairs, then that's actually not some big scary question mark. You know exactly what happened. And part of the service, when we have it done, we are going to have the mechanic take a deep look at the chassis and all the structural integrity of this car, just so we can have a third party confirm that yes, the repairs were done correctly and it is a good and safe and reliable car. Reliable on Ferrari terms, you know what I mean. The branded title, I've bought cars with branded titles before, and it's not as scary as it may seem, so long as you know what you're getting yourself into. That's always the biggest part of a branded title car. As I mentioned before, this car had been in an accident, and from the photos you saw and everything, you could tell that it wasn't a structural damage and it wasn't a really bad accident. Anything you're doing on a Ferrari is going to be expensive to repair. So I've seen a lot of cars with fairly minimal damage that get written off, and it's actually pretty surprising, but just because the estimate to repair it is so high that they get written off pretty easily. And with this one, I picked it up from the seller and drove it down to the showroom, and then, you know, driving it now, and there's no feel to it. Like, there's no shimmy, there's nothing that would indicate there's anything pulling or, you know, anything wrong, like any lingering damage that could affect the drivability of the car, which is very important when you're talking about cars with branded titles. You want to make sure that you're buying a car that you're going to be able to enjoy, that's not going to give you future issues, which is why when this car gets serviced, we're going to make sure to have it thoroughly checked out. Because while I've driven it and I can say that, you know, it's a great car and it drives great, it's always nice to have that third party perspective, you know? The Testarossa is one of my poster cars. It's one that I have always loved, and being in the sales business, I can't buy every car I love, but especially, you know, just it's not good for business. But this is a car that has me really kind of second guessing. Maybe I might need a Testarossa in my life, but because of business, I have enough cars right now. I can't make that commitment at this time. However, I find it very interesting that the Testarossas were so undervalued for so long. And part of it, I think, is due to the major service work and the costs that come with it. However, I remember about 10 years ago, I sold a Testarossa just like this one, but it had less mileage and came with the full set of luggage and everything. I mean, it was just a stunning car. And we sold it for $45,000, which in today's market is like, oh my God, that's the steal of a century. But back then, that was the price of a Testarossa. So because of the generational shift I mentioned earlier, these cars are finally starting to see their time in the spotlight. And I'm very happy for it, because I think they're just an iconic and crazy styling that will withstand the test of time. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, learned a little something about the Testarossa. If you like this, please subscribe and stay tuned, because we got a lot more content coming very soon.